Hi, I'm Scott Fitzmaurice, and I am the Executive Director of Thrive. Thrive is the LGBTQ center in downtown Hyannis. We have a building on Barnstable Road, and we've been there since about 1996. We purchased our own property, and through a remarkable process of fundraising and struggling with finances for a few years, we have maintained great consistent programs and grown stronger. And we have a variety of new things that are emerging in our purview right now, as well as a new property that we're buying to support housing for some of our members. So I figured I'd try to keep this interesting and fun and talk to you a little bit about cultural competence within the realm of working with folks who are LGBTQ. I know that there's a variety of you who will be listening to this, different audiences and such. And so I wanted to make it as applicable as possible. So often when we're thinking of, sensitivity or cultural competence with a certain group of people, sometimes it can be a little bit of apprehension, feeling like it's going to be too much work, or as we were just talking, Cheryl and I were talking a couple minutes ago about how people sometimes are just afraid of misstepping, or the idea of being politically correct sometimes is more than folks want to handle all the time. And I think it's important to keep it real with people, to be able to say a phrase that may or may not be right, and to have someone correct it or let you know what that might mean. So a lot of things are different about working with folks within the LGBTQ community who are experiencing power or control in any of their relationships. And there's a few reasons for that. So first of all, when someone is LGBTQ, their identity is not always immediately obvious to people. So if someone is growing up as a person of color or a person who is a certain ethnicity, a lot of times, not always, there's an awareness of that in the way that they present in their physical identity. And with many identities that are cultural, there is an awareness because you can sort of see it. A lot of times we don't have a chance to get training on language, for example, and definitions. So transgender, let's start off with the definition of transgender. I think people just expect us to sort of know what that word means, but I find that there's not always clarity on that. So to understand transgender, it's important to understand the difference between sex and gender. So sex is simply defined as your physical body. It would be just the attributes of your body that are more male or female. So within the identity of sex, you're either male or female, or it can be a combination actually. That would be termed intersex. But gender is more how you feel in your mind and your experience of identifying as man, woman, or non-binary. Non-binary we'll get to in a little bit. So when you're born in a body that is physically male, but you know that you're a woman, that's when you're transgender. The challenge for that is, I would ask folks if you could just imagine that if today, right now, sitting there listening to this, if you right now were all of a sudden to just close your eyes for a moment and then open them up, and all of a sudden you are the opposite gender, the opposite sex, let's say. And what would that feel like? So imagine if you were going to get up every morning and go out and live your day in a way that you could feel okay about yourself. It might be really necessary for you to let people know that you're in the wrong body and you're the wrong gender. So that's why transgender understanding is really important. So there's also a lot of issues that are created by hormones going through our bodies. So if you identify as a man and you have testosterone and a certain amount of hormones running through your body, that means that you are matched. So both of those things are in alignment. But when you identify as a woman and you have male hormones running through your body at those levels, it really makes your life hard. It's incredibly hard because they're incongruent in a lot of ways. So getting people on the right hormones, getting support around that is really important. But it's in this work, I think it's really critical to understand the difference between being cisgendered, that definition, which is CIS. Cisgendered means that you were born in the body that matches your identity. So I was born male and I'm a man, and that works. And I don't have to think about it. It's a privilege. But if you're transgender, then everything is work. Everything is work to sort of align. And it's incredibly difficult. Now, trans folks are very high on the list of folks who are likely to experience violence or disrespect at a level that can harm them. And as many as 50% of trans folks die by age 25, either at their own hands or at the hands of others. Let's say that again. Yeah, you heard the number right. So as many as 50% of trans folks die by age 25 at their own hands or the hands of others. Part of that is due to the concept in our culture of what masculinity means and how masculinity needs to be defended in our culture. Part of that is also because many trans folks don't pass, if you want to use that word, or may not look clearly like the gender that they are presenting as all the time. And so when they travel, when they go in different routes, a lot of times they're not as safe as other people who are cisgendered would be. It's a lot of work being trans. It's an amazing life, but it is a lot of work, and it's important for us to be able to really understand that. Also, if someone is not out about their gender identity, let's just say that you're an officer of the law and you roll into a situation where someone presents to you and they tell you their name, and it's not immediately clear to you if their gender is very defined and obvious how they're presenting. So let's say that someone comes out and they tell you their name is Willow, and you aren't sure how to handle that question-wise. You could say something like, "Hi, Willow, and is there a pronoun that you prefer?" That's a great way to say that. So what it does, it gives them the chance to say, "No, I don't use pronouns. I'm non-binary, and you can just call me Willow." But it's a way of handling it so that a lot of times you may have to put down sex and gender on the report, and by asking that question, you give them a chance to identify themselves. I'll go on to that definition of non-binary now. Non-binary is one of the hardest things for us to understand because in our lives, most of us have grown up with men and women. It's clear, it's defined, there's really no question about it. And unfortunately, that makes it harder for us to understand non-binary. So having two genders, even though it's almost everything we know, is an anomaly in the world, if you can believe it. So what I mean by that is most cultures actually have two-spirited folks or other identities for other genders besides just male and female. So folks that have attributes of both genders, if you wanted to say two genders, are considered to be two-spirited in a lot of native and tribal communities. And they are the most revered within tribal culture of almost anyone. A lot of times LGBTQ people were chosen to be the adopted parents of any young children who had been orphaned by their parents being lost through disease or in battle. And the two-spirited people were said to be able to understand men and women better and be able to connect and also believed to be much more intuitive. So that's sort of the norm and the standard in the world. But our Western culture has grown very rapidly, and Western culture obviously was based a lot in reproduction. A lot of that is around, the Christian-based doctrines, which have obviously pushed reproduction for obvious reasons because faith communities want to grow. And the Catholic Church as well has had a lot to do with that over the last few hundred years. And so we're very entrenched in the binary, but the more you can do to sort of step out of the box and try to understand this, the better. Now, anytime that you're dealing with trans folks, it's important to try to use their name if you're not sure of the pronoun. So I might say David went to the store, and then afterwards I called David later in the day to see how they were doing. So instead of saying him. So it's really important if you can try to practice that, talking without pronouns. That's one of the most important skills you can learn today. When you talk without pronouns, you allow the person to be recognized by their name and not recognized by a pronoun that may or may not be wrong. So to explain what that's like when people are misgendered or the wrong pronoun is used, imagine if somebody were to call you he or she, whichever they don't usually call you, all day. So let's say you would go to an event or a party and you would walk in and someone would say, "Hey, how's it going?" Blank your name. And then they introduce you and say, "Oh, this is my friend, she and I have known each other for years. They use the wrong pronoun. And for some of you, that may feel perfectly fine. For me, it does. But for a lot of people, it really doesn't feel good. And so it's a little bit about transgender. There's certainly a lot more to know about that, but that gives you a little bit to know about it. And that talks a little bit about the difference between sex and gender, which is helpful to know. But I'd like you all to realize that the reason it's so important to be supportive to LGBTQ folks is this. So we go out in the world every day, we get millions of messages that we don't exist, we have no value, and we don't belong. I just need you to understand that. Okay, I'm just reporting the weather. That's what it's like. Every time we see a message of heteronormity, which is heterosexual folks together, people wearing rings on their fingers when you know it's an opposite gendered partner. When I go out in my day, I live in sort of a non-metropolitan area. When I go through my day, I see heterosexual people all the time that seem heterosexual. And I don't really see gay people much. And so that reinforces that I don't exist, I don't have value, and I don't have worth. It's important to understand that because people get really isolated and all those messages that they get tend to make them feel really bad about themselves. They feel just not reflected in what they see, especially young people who are not out. So a lot of young people, before they've come out, they're really thinking they're a horrible person because all they hear is, oh, that's gay, or you fag, that sort of stuff. That's why language is really important. A lot of times we think it's only language, but it's a lot more than that. Have you ever not gotten good feedback on information, and so you kind of get a sense of what something means and is, and then you continue to learn on your own, but you don't really research it, and you get to a place where all of a sudden you think you really know something about this topic, but you realize you're actually way over here when the information's here? I have people I've known in my life that have sort of been there, and I've seen that unfold. And so it's important, I think, really to get to a place where we really sort of understand a lot of the issues that affect the trans community and the LGBTQ community. So let me just go through some more definitions. I want to keep this light and easy. Other definitions that I think are important: bisexual is the capacity to be attracted to folks of either gender. It sort of assumes the idea of our dominant paradigm in our culture, which is man and women, gay and straight, and then bisexual. So there's a certain limited number of categories there, if you will. There's another term called pansexual it's very similar to the word bisexual, except it recognizes that there are more than two genders. And it means that a person who is bisexual is attracted to someone for a lot of reasons, but gender just isn't a limiting factor. It doesn't mean that they have to have 10 partners. It doesn't mean they have to have 2 partners. It can mean anything. But what it does mean is they have the capacity to love or be attracted to a person of either gender, of multiple genders. Pansexual is a little bit different in that it sort of recognizes all the different genders that are out there. And it's a person who is attracted to someone for who they are, for their energy, for their vibe, it can be anything about them, but gender is just not really a factor at all. It's really more about holistically being attracted to the person, and the gender is much less. I think of it more in alignment with, and this is just my stuff, but I think of it more in alignment with being Hindu or being Buddhist, in that you're more attracted to the person's spirit or soul than you might be to their body. And there's a lot of stuff you could really think deep into this, but arguably as we get older in our lives, folks that are in a relationship, the physicality becomes less. I have friends who are in their 80s and 90s that still have, great sex lives, and all that's still really important to them. But most folks I know, their relationships sort of evolved to this place of being really incredibly deep, caring, loving relationships that are non-physical. And the attraction changes as far as, as folks get older and their bodies aren't as attractive and all that stuff. But they're loyal to each other because they love and care each other. So it's fascinating how much emphasis we put on opposite gender attraction, when in reality our relationships are based on so much that is really significant, that means a lot more after we get to be over 65, over 75, over 85, and some of us over 100. So there are several barriers to, I think, reporting things in the LGBTQ community. We tend to isolate ourselves because it's safer. A lot of us have trauma. I think we want to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care. So a person who is LGBTQ has generally been through unbelievable faith trauma. Let me try to express this. So, as a young person in my faith community growing up, I wanted to do everything right by the book. And I was told that I could not be gay, that there were not gay people, and it was an abomination. Now, a lot of folks think, well, we don't really talk about that anymore, and it's gotten easier, but it really hasn't. A lot of these faith communities, still the Catholic Church is one of the biggest offenders. I think the Catholic Church has been 20 years behind every major social issue that we have climbed on over the years and started to understand. I think there were women that were in abusive relationships that could not get their relationships annulled because the church said no when they applied, and many of them were killed. And no one ever talks about this, but it's important to talk about it. So a lot of great people within the Catholic faith, but the institution's been behind. Now, there's a great pope there now, and things are changing, and I'm grateful for that. But the number of people in the LGBTQ community who have taken their own lives because of the rhetoric out of the Catholic Church is astounding. And I also want to talk just a little bit about, because it's a can of worms, I want to talk a little bit about pedophilia and also about what it means, stereotypes and such. And so there are also stereotypes about sexual abuse and about folks in the LGBTQ community. Well over 90% of folks who tend to be involved in sexual abuse with folks who are younger tend to not be LGBTQ. But there's this perception of the opposite, which makes it really difficult, I think, for people in the LGBTQ community. There is also this thing where in the LGBTQ community, it is harder to date because you cannot meet people as easily, depending on where you live. So if you're a person who is 14, 15, 16, 17 and starting to come out, it is very common to have like a partner or a boyfriend or experiences with folks who are older. And that doesn't jive with our laws. So it's an interesting situation where I can remember when I was younger, I had folks that I was dating who were over 18, but I was under 18. And that was fine with me. I was able to handle that. Now, I know not everybody is able to handle that, but it's important for us to be mindful of that. A lot of times there'll be a 3 to 6 or 7 year gap within relationships in the queer community, if you will. So it's important to think of that. And there's also this natural need to be in a relationship, of course, and not be as isolated and such. So that's enough on that. So that's about the millions of messages. I think remembering whether someone's out or not, if you do know them. Also, if you're providing care, understanding what it might mean if someone's not out. So if you use the wrong pronoun with someone, or you're not sure what to call someone as far as a name, just ask open-ended questions. And folks are really grateful if you even try, because so many people don't try. And again, I'm going to say that line again, is there a pronoun you prefer? Is a great question to ask. It just sounds like you've had so much training if you ask a question like that. Someone's like, wow, you went out of your way to understand that that's an important question to ask me. It's incredible. So a little bit about our organization, Thrive. So Thrive is the LGBTQ community center of Cape Cod and the Islands, and we were formed in 1996. We provide a positive youth development program where folks can become leaders, and we really dare people to be extraordinary. I find that LGBTQ folks are oftentimes more intuitive, a lot of times really incredibly smart and able to achieve and accomplish more, partly because they've been through hard stuff, but also because I believe they just genetically are wired to make great legacy impact on this planet if they can get beyond the self-hate that a lot of times they carry with them. So having friends and people in our community that are really supportive of us allows us to become supportive of ourselves. So one of the biggest challenges is when we're not out to ourselves, the self-harm that we do to ourselves of just not appreciating and supporting ourselves is really difficult. But I remember when I came out to my friend Jacqueline when I was younger, she was totally supportive of me, even though she didn't understand yet. And because she was so supportive, I found the strength in me to be able to come out and believe in myself. And then years later, she told me that she was a nervous wreck when I came out, but she never told me that at the time. And as the first person that I came out to, that was really, really helpful. So I would ask you to try to push yourself out of your comfort zone. If you're interacting with people that might be experiencing services or are seeking services who are not yet totally out. Also, like we right now are experiencing COVID, which is sort of a new experience for our communities. And this video may be seen long after this, but this year is the year 2000, and COVID has changed it to where communities that we were mocking just 3 years ago as a nation, Islamic communities that were wearing face masks, that a lot of our leadership in this country was mocking, has taken us to a new place where today we're wearing face masks everywhere we go. And this may become something more common in the future. So learning how to be able to help people in non-traditional ways is really good. I would encourage people to consider as a barrier removal to be able to spend a little bit of time thinking about how you can make your services much more user-friendly. So going back to sort of the conversation about faith and trauma, so most of us in the LGBTQ community have experienced incredible faith trauma. We've also, a lot of us experienced trauma with law enforcement, and because of that, it's really difficult sometimes for us to interact with another faith community or law enforcement. Also, too, sometimes things become public once you start a process, things that you might not want to be public. So let's say that you're not out to your family, or let's say that you have a job where you can't be out. Let's say you're a teacher. Let's say you're a middle school or an elementary school teacher. Most people in that profession who are LGBTQ, particularly gay men, can't be out. So understanding all that stuff is helpful. But having your services be accessible in ways that are non-traditional, I think a lot of teachers do this really well. If someone doesn't have to go into a police station, doesn't have to go to a guidance office to make stuff happen, if instead they can just show up in the community, or they can access it in a different way, it's really helpful. So I'd like you to do a little bit of self-reflection right now. I'm going to ask you a few questions. How are we doing on time back there? Okay, good. Let's just say that I'm going to spin some questions to you. Normally I do this in an interactive environment. A lot of us may feel like we're totally okay with gender and transgender issues, but my question is, how okay are we with it? Because we don't get a lot of experience to understand that identity. So I want you to imagine if your best friend, whoever you hang out with all the time, if your best friend were to come out to you and disclose that they're transgender, how would that be for you? Let's just say your best friend is someone that you do certain activities with, but they're disclosing they're transgender and they're going to begin transitioning. By the way, we use the word transition or transitioning. We don't use the word transitioned because it never really completes. It's always an ongoing process. And imagine if they came out to you and they're going to start presenting as the opposite gender, let's say, that you are used to. So let's just assume in the binary gender structure. If they're a man, they're going to be presenting as a woman now. So how would that be for you? Would that still be comfortable? Would you be okay with it? Would you have their back? That's the first question. The next question is, if your son or daughter were to tell you the same thing, would you still be comfortable with that? So think of who they are, what their name is, picture their face, and think about whether you'd be comfortable with that. And the next question is, if your parents, let's say that you have parents that are living and in your life, in a positive part of your life, if one of your parents came to you and told you that they were going to transition because they are finally disclosing their gender identity. Now, having said that, I want to remind you that gender identity is always innately in us. We're born with it. It's not a learned behavior. And so when you are expressing your gender identity, that means you've struggled for many years with it. And the only thing that's changed is your bestowing great trust on this person and increasing your level of authenticity with them. When I have parents that come and sit down with me and say to me, my son just came out as gay and we're really liberal and comfortable with it, but we're destroyed, we're wrecked, and I don't know what to do about this, we thought we'd always be okay with this stuff, but he's our son, and I say to them, congratulations, because this is probably the best thing that'll ever happen to your family. And a year from now, you will say this is the best thing that ever happened to your family. But there's one rule here. You can put your values first and try to figure out love in the process. Or you can put unconditional love first, and your values will follow, and they will remain intact largely. So folks that put their values first, a lot of times there increases the amount of distance between them and the people they know. And folks who put love first, the relationship grows closer and they see them more. A lot of times people don't come out until they have an escape plan. A lot of people come out just before they go to college or at a time when they're not as dependent. Like, I want to come out to my dad, but I'm afraid he'll throw me out of the house. If you could hear the stories that I hear from people of what they're afraid of, when you're in the closet, you kind of make yourself nuts thinking about what's going to happen if you come out to people. You're so scared of losing the people most important to you, and you're afraid of what they'll do. So you build it up to a level that's usually unrealistic, and usually people are more supportive. But if someone comes out to you, there's a few things you can say. One is, thank you for sharing that with me, for trusting me and being open. I appreciate you letting me know. Okay. Things that aren't as helpful would be to say, oh, I kind of had a sense you were gay or trans, or I knew. Other things that kind of make it about you, which is a lot of times our tendency when we're talking to people to make it a little bit about us. But just keep it totally about them. They're sharing something that's very personal and a bit of a risk. And so that's helpful too. I'm going to move a little bit into talking about why I do this work and how you can be extraordinary in this work. I always put a lot of pressure on myself before I do these presentations and trainings because I want them to be unbelievable. I want you to get things that you hear from me that you've never heard before. Things that are like, with all the data that's out there, all the information that you glean through, to actually get more than just one sentence. I find when I go to a training, I'll get like one sentence, something really great usually. But this can be applied to all identities you work with. So in our world, there are certain things that all of us need. So we need an opportunity to contribute at all ages, a sense of belonging, and non-judgmental community. Those are like the three most important things. And there was a study done in Rosetto, in New Jersey, back between 1937 and 1978, whatever, where they found this community where they never got sick, and they didn't have depression, and there was no suicide, and they couldn't figure out what was going on with it. So the federal government spent millions of dollars studying this community. Now, it was a Sicilian community, and there was it was small. There weren't a ton of people there, but the data was striking. When you looked at the charts, it was like, what is this community doing? Why do they not have all these other problems? And after researching them for like 50 years, they found some pretty striking things. So they had a diet of 41% lard. They smoked. They drank vodka. The women too. And so immediately they were like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are these people so healthy? Why did they not get cancer? Why did they not get heart disease? What's going on? They found something extraordinary. There is a protective factor that the body somehow produces when you have an opportunity to contribute, a meaningful role, a sense of belonging, knowing your connection to community and everyone around you, that supersedes those other risk factors in such a way that it's stronger. It's a stronger force. So that defines all the work that I do. Bringing people in, making them feel included, making them feel valued and appreciated. The other thing too that can really help you with this is pausing for 10 extra seconds with people when they're talking to us. So before we respond, I think just pausing and listening and an occasional nod. Taking that time, I try to do it when I'm busiest, because that's I think it really gets me doing the work. So when you are totally busy and you've got like a bunch of things going on and you don't have a second to give someone, I'm like, I have 10 seconds. And I look and I listen and I make a comment back to them that's not just active listening, but lets them know as best as I can that I not only understand what they just told me, but I'm guessing at what that might mean for them. So I add another sentence to that. So if someone's saying, you know, I'm in a situation at home and I'm not out and I want to file a report, but I'm afraid of doing a restraining order because with my job, that might look bad for me. And so I might say, I guess I have a sense of what you're saying, that you're afraid of what the implications might be, but more than that, it sounds like you're in a position that really doesn't have an easy answer. It sounds like it's really good that you're talking to me. So something like that just allows them to realize you really heard them and you really connected to them in a way that's different. People don't do that very often. It's incredible how rare it is that folks do that. You know, my sister's, she's really a great person. She's a professional photographer and she won a Pulitzer, and she just has this knack of accessing people in ways that's unbelievable. She'll go photograph a really famous sports figure or presidents or whatever, and she'll get access. She'll end up in their house, taking pictures. Because she makes people feel like they matter so much. So there's matter versus marginalized. When people are experiencing trauma, they're marginalized. If you can make them feel like they matter, have value, and they're strong, it's really going to help them. Okay. So other language that I think means a lot to people is being relevant or being irrelevant. And I'd like you all to think of a time when you felt like you were really uncomfortable because of your gender. So can you think of a time when somebody in the community or some situation of people made you uncomfortable because of your gender? When we ask this question in groups, we usually have people move to the yes side or the no side of the room or the maybe side. And normally the men don't move and the women move on this question, saying that they've experienced it more. But I think for men, our greatest strength is that we're sensitive and that we're caring. And wisdom is knowing when to show it. That I wish someone had told me when I was younger. I think that would have been really more helpful than a lot of things. But understanding that sensitivity links us to so much power. I think a lot of times we're encouraged to shut that down, and it's considered to be like a weakness in a lot of ways. So next thing, a little bit more about appropriate language that might be helpful. So we usually say a person is transgender or not identifies as transgender. We just say that they are transgender. Just like you would say they are a man, they are a woman. So they would be a transgender man. If the person was born female, but they're identifying as male, you would say, you would use the pronoun that they prefer now. So you have to kind of let the other pronoun go. I encourage you all to just not use pronouns. Some people use the pronoun they, which is plural in our culture, but it also means you. It means him or her right now. It's a synonym for him or her, but it doesn't have the gender attached to it. A lot of people like the pronoun they because they identify as non-binary. A little bit more about the non-binary. So folks who are non-binary, they just don't embrace a specific gender. It's just not who they are to be one gender. It's impossible for them to be one gender. They are both genders or many genders. Now that is impossible for us to understand, but I think in 15 years many of us will. But all you need to know is that using specific gender terms with them is really offensive. And most of them will let it go. It happens all the time. But the last thing we want to do is offend people unnecessarily. So if you just use their name and don't use pronouns at all, they are going to notice that. Even if you haven't mentioned their identity, if it's not clear whether they're out or gay or any of that. I also want to talk about our invisible families. So I'm going to talk about Falmouth High School a bit. So we did trainings for years in Falmouth High School. And every year that we would go back, I remember in the beginning, we went in and the teachers there were great and we did amazing work with the students, and the students were so responsive. But each year I would go back, a different teacher would come up to me and say, can I talk to you for a minute? My brother came out, and he's in his 50s now, and can I talk to you for a minute, And so we had that conversation. What was incredible is that in Falmouth and in other schools and other communities we've worked, at some point, almost everyone comes up to me and says, I want to share this with you. In my own family, my close family, there is someone who identifies as gay or bi or transgender. And so we're everywhere, yet we perceive that it's just 10% of the population who identify within LGBTQ. But in reality, that mother who has a gay son is affected by whether you're LGBTQ culturally competent. That person whose best friend that they work with is gay is affected by whether you're LGBTQ competent. The child or grandchild that you're going to have that you don't know yet is not heterosexual or cisgendered. You want to be ready for. And the person you haven't met who may be adding great things to your life is someone who would appreciate your being culturally competent. So there is so much that we can do to be open and welcoming in ways that are really going to be tangible to the work that we can do. But I think being present, caring, open, you don't have to have all the language down, but people can tell if you're a person that likes to control the conversation. They can tell if you have to have it defined, all your I's dotted and your T's crossed. But instead, if you're a person who can just listen. So a youth development lens is what I also call individual development. So a lot of you that have been in education maybe understand what youth development is, but I'm going to tell you it's amazing. So individual development would be that person who trusted you when you were underage to drive the car. That person who trusted you with the key to their house at a young age. That person who believes in you more outside of your family. So someone outside the family or outside your nuclear setup who believes in you more and believes that you can be extraordinary allows you to achieve incredible levels. And a lot of times we listen through an age lens, which completely shuts out folks who are not between, let's say the ages of 25 and I'd say 50, really, in our culture. So when people become 80, they experience this unbelievable level of feeling invisible. People don't look at them. And then if they have a walker, people don't make eye contact generally. So what happens is they become really isolated. And the remarkable thing is that most of us who live long enough are going to experience that. And it's hardest for white men of privilege because we have been living in this world in a way where we're able to work hard and push ourselves and be successful. And it's not until we get to a point where we start to lose mobility or start to have cognitive problems or experience something else like that, where we're then going to look back and understand how it might have been for others around us, maybe who move around in a wheelchair or do other things. So it's great. The more of that we can get now, the better. And I think one of the trainings that I went to when I asked about, if you're witnessing someone getting out of their car and they have a disability, is it appropriate to ask them if they want help? How should I ask if they want help? And the feedback that I've got from folks is great. It's like, absolutely, always ask if people need help, but then don't be so controlling about it that you sort of need to save face and be like, still help them, or just let it go. I think it's so beautiful that you asked and so thoughtful, and the greatest thing you can do is hear what they say. And that's going to be true in other care work. If you're working with somebody who is coming to you for assistance or advocacy work, to really hear what they want, what they're ready for, even if you don't think it's a wise choice for them. To say, hey, you know what? I would say that may not be the best course of action, and I support you 100% in that. Then they'll feel heard and really sort of understood. remember in our culture, we do this thing called deficit identity. Each of us has been told over and over what we're not good at. We may know that, oh, maybe I'm Puerto Rican, and so I'm not positive because of that in other people's view. Or maybe I'm Irish and people don't see me, thank you, in that light. Or maybe I am a person who doesn't handle paperwork well, or a person who has a house that's not neat, that's disorganized, or maybe I'm a hoarder, or maybe I don't manage money well. So we carry that, and we're sort of taught that that's who we are. So deficit identity it's just so insane. So most of us look at who we are based on this identity which doesn't exist, okay? So you are the things you aren't. Is that crazy? So you are disorganized, or you are all those things, but those are things you aren't. What you are good at is everybody has at least two phenomenal strengths, unbelievable strengths, that if they channel everything through in their life, they are really successful, but they get caught up in the things that they're not good at. And that's as a culture, we do sort of like reinforce that a lot. So a lot of our processes for applying for disability and stuff like that reinforce our deficit identity. So we may need to get those financial resources, but the less that we have to face it as a deficit identity, the better it is. So it's a difficult course to navigate, but it's pretty important. The reason I talk about this right now is I think it's important to understand that if you could not reinforce deficit identity in working with people, that would be really good. So if someone's a mess and they're, like just barely getting to meet with you or talk to you, find out immediately what's going well in their life. And so that may be that they got up today, that they showed up. It could be something as little as that. And appreciative inquiry tells us that when we focus on what's working with people and we build up from that, in a matter of time that's not far away, suddenly everything is working in their lives. And so for me, if I'm working with someone who has addiction problems and their life is way out of balance, I might say to them, well, like, how long have you gone without, utilizing substances? You've gone like 3 days? Cool, that's 3 days going without that. And I get them to remove that language completely. They don't mention the substance words anymore. They just take that all out of your mind, all out of your, because you go to meetings sometimes, people talk about stuff that brings it up. I believe in sort of a slightly different approach than that. Strength-based, focusing on what we're good at, all that stuff. Trauma is really horrible. It shuts people down in ways where they cannot function. And so the more that we're helping them come to their strengths, the trauma shapes our work, and it leads us into the work we do a lot once we have our stuff figured out. So many people have become therapists or counselors or gone into law enforcement because of their trauma. Use that as a strength and let other people know this will make you extraordinary. And getting through it will be a process. So I'm just going to kind of start wrapping it up here because I just have a few things to go. And then we'll do the other 7 hours later, okay? A little more about ageism. Ageism is it's the single greatest ism that we will face in our lives. Arguably, I would say that the animal industry is food. How we handle that and how that's happening and how we turn a blind eye to that, I would say is actually probably greater. But with that aside, ageism is phenomenal. It is so phenomenal. People are so irrelevant because of the messages that we've received. And as a gay man, I felt like it was my responsibility to figure out my own ageism. But there's also adultism. What that means is that when you work with a younger person or an older person, you see them first through your age lens. So if a person is younger and you want to ask them what's going on, how you doing, I would usually sit down in a way that I'm lower than them, like in a chair, or I'd kick back so that I'm lower than them, which changes the power dynamic. And then I might say to them, hey, so what's going on with you? That's it. And then I just shut up and listen. A lot of times I'll hear adults talk to people who are younger and they'll say, oh yeah, so what's going on with you? How's school? Like, what are you doing in school? What's going on with that? And have you been doing anything else? Any sports? And the question just keeps going. Like there's just a few semicolons in it, So I think just to ask one question and be present and just look, into someone's eyes is really helpful, because then you become relevant in their lives. And when we know that when one person believes in us in our peer group and one person in an older group as we're a younger person, it just changes everything. And the likelihood that we would attempt to take our own life just goes way, way down. I'm going to talk a little bit about suicide because I think it's critical to talk about it. So the reason suicide happens in our community is because we don't talk about it. If we talked about it all the time, it would probably come close to ending. But there's a taboo on talking about it. So what happens is it's counterintuitive. We think if we talk about it, it'll happen. So I would encourage you to look up online basic suicide curriculum. SOS is one that you can do. It's really easy training, but what's important is to be able to understand that if someone comes up to me and they tell me they're thinking of taking their life, the first thing we think is, oh my gosh, how am I going to handle that? So all we have to do is not overreact and say to them, wow, you must have some stuff going on. Jeez, wow. I mean, to be at that point, there must be a lot that you're handling. Like just empathetic, understanding comments, right? Because someone in any work could say this to you anytime. And usually we say what? Oh, you can be fine. Or we think, oh, gee, do I have to report them? So I've been a mandatory reporter in Thrive since 1996. And I have never done paperwork on anyone because that system has not been a system that works well for people in trauma, and it's not been a system that is helpful. Instead, I work really closely with them so they take an active role in their own safety and well-being. So if someone comes to me and they tell me that they've experienced sexual violence, let's say, I'm supposed to report that. But if I'm helping them take an active role in correcting the trauma within them and making their lives better, that's what needs to happen. So as long as they're doing that with me and I can take them to a place where they're handling that, it's better. It's better if they're handling it actively and such. And the success we've had with this is pretty extraordinary. Now, my way of operating is different than a lot of folks, and I certainly respect both. I think understanding that a lot of times if it's a younger person and you report, they might lose the place they live. They might be in DCF care right away. And so I had a young person in our group who was experiencing active abuse in the house, and they were afraid they were going to be kicked out of the house. They decided to not report it and not do anything with it at that point. I decided not to report it at that point too, but I worked with them really closely, and I showed up at the house, and I was there, and I got involved with the family a little bit so that I was a presence. The violence decreased, just because I think folks felt like there were more eyes on the household, and within a year, that person had emancipated themselves and got their own place. That was more effective in the process in that situation, I think. All right, let me think what else I want to mention to you. I want you to think about a little more about language and phrasing that you can use with people. So obviously using words like partner are great, but also remember singleism. So often we feel like we want to ask people if they're in a relationship or if they are dating with someone or married. A lot of our forms request all that stuff. The less you require someone to do a lot of those questions, the less you are forcing them to face the disappointments in their life. So are you married? First question. If you're divorced, it's not really a question you want to hear. If you are single and someone asks you if you're married or if you're in a relationship, that requires you to face deficit identity in our culture. Like, no, I'm single. And then there's like an explanation of explaining it. I just put that out there because I think understanding, asking open-ended questions like, hey, how was your weekend? Is a really good thing, especially if people aren't really out around you. So I feel like I've covered a lot, and I'd like us to remember that. Imagine that we have our bodies and we have our soul, and that they are separate for the purposes of this conversation. Your body will become dust on this planet at some point, unless you figure out how to live forever. And what will matter is how you make people feel. And if you make them feel relevant and connected and not isolated. I would offer that whatever your belief is, that your soul has the capacity to continue separate from the body, possibly. And maybe we're all connected. Maybe we're all connected and all one in some ways. And so So often we see someone else's situation and it's separate from us. When we work with people, imagine if it is your situation. When I have a tenant that's not paying rent, which is rare, just because they are in my other business, because they want to be a jerk, I try to think, so they are me. There's a connection there. I wonder why they're doing that. It brings me to a place where I don't accept it, and it doesn't make me any less angry, but it reminds me of how I need to stay grounded in this. So Thrive is available. You can reach us on my cell phone, or you can call our office, just 508-778-7744. We have been working in the community, providing a space where people come and they meet on Wednesdays, usually in person for 2 to 3 hours. We also have dances, special events, and we collaborate with PFLAG, which provides parent and family support at the same time. I'm going to wrap it up right now. And remember that when someone's experiencing a loss of power, the best thing you can do is realize that they've been marginalized in so many ways over their life, and you have the opportunity to not misstep and to make them feel like they're important. Thanks.